Rick Stengel, the author of Information Wars and the former Chief Marketing Officer of the United States of America. At least, Rick, that's how you introduce yourself in the book. What did you do as the Chief Marketing Officer of the United States? Quite a title.
Quite a title. Well, the real title is Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, the second longest title at the State Department. And that basically is the soft power end of government. It's about marketing the USA. That is the traditional nature of the job. The public affairs part is spokespeople, and there's spokespeople in every embassy around the world.
Before you were the Chief Marketing Officer of the United States, you were, amongst many things, the editor-in-chief of Time magazine. So why did you go into government?
Why did I go into government? I believe in public service. In fact, one of the issues I started when I was editor of Time is the case for national service. And I used to campaign every year for people going and doing some kind of public work. And I always knew that I would do it eventually, and I'd kind of run to the end of my term at Time. And I was a very big fan of Barack Obama's, and they asked me to come in.
It's kind of weird that you're a fan of public service, because at least according to your book, or the way that government is portrayed in your book, in a lot of ways, government is profoundly dysfunctional and slow.
That's true, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to improve it or go into public service. I still found it very empowering to stand behind the flag, as somebody said. And yes, I found government to be slower and bigger and much more inefficient than I had ever imagined. In fact, I used to tell my conservative friends, you should be in favor of big government because big government makes nothing happen. But I still wouldn't ever urge anybody not to go into public service because of that.
So you were the guy doing US soft power, and you happened to get involved in politics at a time where America, like it or not, was dragged into a soft war, the information war. What happened?
On this spectrum between soft and hard power, there was an entity that was a hard power entity under me, which was CSCC, the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, which was created under Hillary Clinton to combat a terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda that was doing dynamic new stuff on the internet.
I've heard of it.
This is pre-ISIS. And so I got interested in the information war because of that group and because of the rise of ISIS. And then we saw the rise of Russian disinformation at almost the same time. Because just as ISIS was coming to the fore, that's when Russia annexed Crimea, and we saw this tsunami of disinformation around that.
Rick, connect up the crisis of democracy in the West, or maybe you disagree there's a crisis, at least some of the issues or problems of democracy in the West with this information war.
So I'm a kind of American information exceptionalist. Jefferson and the framers believed that for a democracy to work, there needed to be an informed citizen. The core of democracy is this idea that human beings can govern themselves. And for people to govern themselves, they need information and knowledge to make the wisest decision. And that doesn't even mean that they'll make the wisest decision.
What's so unique about the last 20 years when it comes to these information wars? Because throughout history there have been one kind of information war or another.
What's different now with the rise of social media is the absolute universality and instantaneousness of this disinformation. Once upon a time, the disinformation, it's like the Russians would have to plant a story in a little newspaper in India and then cover it in the Russian press. Now, the smallest tweet can go global almost instantly. What is local is global, what is global is local. That's never happened before in human history.
A lot of people trace today's sort of history of democracy from the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, but 1989, of course, was also the year that Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web in Geneva. When historians look back at 1989, do you think that the invention of the internet, in terms of the challenges and problems of democracy in the 21st century, that will seem more important than the fall of the wall? Or will these two things be connected?
I think they're connected, because while Tim Berners-Lee was inventing the internet, there was a KGB officer in Dresden in 1989 looking at the fall of the Berlin Wall and thinking, it didn't fall with a single bullet being fired, with a single missile. The Soviet Union had spent billions and billions of dollars on weaponry, and it fell because of what? Soft power. That was the lesson that Putin took from the fall of the Berlin Wall. And when he became the head of Russia, he tried to marshal Russia's soft power. He took over the television stations. He started creating television stations, and he basically transformed old-style Soviet active measures into new-style modern Russian disinformation.
So if I'm a Russian in this conversation, I would say to you, well, aren't you suggesting then that the Americans are no different from anyone else? You're presenting your arguments about democracy and freedom. They're presenting their arguments about what they see as democracy and freedom.
It's a valid argument, but I would say that they also go on both sides of that issue, because they're not only arguing their side in a kind of legitimate way, but they're arguing their side through the strategic use of misinformation and disinformation. I mean, what we saw around the annexation of Crimea and the soft invasion of Ukraine, just outright lies about the invasion. You know, where Putin said those little green men weren't Russian soldiers, where they've lied about the support for the troops in eastern Ukraine. They lied about the downing of the Malaysian Airlines. I mean, there's a difference not just in degree between what we do, but in kind. And the Russians are willing to do things that I think Western countries just can't and won't do.
How would you describe the state of democracy in the world today?
It's retreating. The number of countries that are considered democracies has been going down for about 10 years now. There's a return to blood and borders of countries that want everybody to look like everybody in the country. They want everyone to have the same heritage, and they have these strong men leaders that are authoritarian. There's a return to this kind of authoritarian personality that people used to talk about in the 1950s. They want a kind of a strong person leader, not someone who's thoughtful or introspective or is even thinking about democracy. I think democracy is in retreat.
And why is that? And I'd like you to try and sort of separate the cause and effect of the information war. Are people longing for strong leaders because they're sort of suffering from the vertigo of all this information?
We've done a good job of educating people about the freedoms of democracy, the things they can do, but not the responsibilities. I remember Sandra Day O'Connor said to me, we're going to pay a terrible price in the US for having stopped teaching civics 40 years ago. And we have paid that price. I mean, you had people voting in America, and including a candidate running who didn't know the three branches of government, or what the responsibility of a citizen is in a democracy. And that primary responsibility is to be knowledgeable and to participate. And I think we've taken agency away from people. And what people like about that is it's kind of a relief not to have to make a decision yourself. It's kind of a relief not to have to learn about things and to listen to that strongman leader who's telling me what to believe.
I mean, we can't blame Facebook for that. We can't blame Putin for that. We can't even blame Donald Trump for that.
In fact, I actually think the opportunity for fixing democracy using those platforms and using technology is enormous. I think people overplay how they've undermined democracy. I think they underplay how much they can do to fix democracy. Why wouldn't Facebook be telling people, here are the three branches of government. Here's your responsibility as a citizenship. That's nonpartisan, that's bipartisan. The platforms can do that.
So how could these platforms transform themselves from kind of echo chambers to serious publications that will inform a civic culture?
Well, remember, they started, as you know, using third-party content and monetizing that. Not creating content themselves, but using, pictures that we took of our kids or cats or whatever it is, and we gave that to each other, and then they sold advertising against it. Their whole model was different than the traditional press model, which was monetizing content that they created. Are they publishers? Absolutely, they're publishers, but not in the traditional sense. One of the things that needs to change, at least in the US, is the perception of them, according to the law, as not being liable for their content. So Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act.
The
safe harbor, and the fact that they're not liable for their content. In fact, the legislation was created with good intentions, which is they didn't want the companies to censor people too much. But what that did was it gave them a kind of immunity for all of this hate speech and negative content that they have. They need to be a little more responsible, and they also need to become more like traditional publishers themselves and giving people the kind of content that make them better citizens.
Rick, you know Silicon Valley pretty well. I know you said you were an advisor to Snapchat. You've spent some time with Mark Zuckerberg. When you were in government, you did a series of meetings with them about the reliability.
I made Mark Zuckerberg Person of the Year as well. Okay.
If you said to Mark Zuckerberg, I want you to use Facebook to make people more responsible as citizens, make them better informed. Of course, he'd nod and smile and say, oh, that's a great idea, but he wouldn't really get it, and he certainly wouldn't help you.
I disagree. I think he would get it. And I think he comes from this earlier vision of the internet as the great democratization of information, that it actually gave people agency, not only to learn, but to communicate. Every person was a journalist. And so I think he gets that, and I think he is dismayed by what has happened, and certainly dismayed by the impression that people have that the internet, whatever that is undermining our democracy. I don't think he wants that, and I don't think the other Silicon Valley companies want it either. In fact, their whole business premise is about people being able to make decisions about the content they consume. In authoritarian states, people don't make that decision about the content they consume.
I know you're again, it's a bit of a joke, the chief marketing officer of America, but you never collected up the data of all American citizens and sold them to advertisers, which is essentially what Facebook does.
Yes, but I also think that's where the legislation has to change. The legislation has to err on the side of privacy. And by the way, what a lot of people don't realize is Americans have more privacy protections than Europeans do and than people around the world. From the government. What they don't have privacy protections from is Facebook and Google that you give your most intimate information to. That we need to be protected from them selling that information. We need to know when they're selling it and to whom they're selling it. There must be much, much more transparency. And I think the platform companies realize that too, and they're getting ready for that day.
So let's focus more specifically on the fixes to democracy. If you say the problem is misinformation and the crisis of propaganda on the internet. Can America learn from Europe on this? Because the Europeans, and particularly the EU, has been much more active and aggressive in regulating big tech and making some of these big platforms accountable for the stuff that's published on them.
One of the things that changed my perception of how information should be used and could be used was the Charlie Hebdo crisis in Paris. And I had always been a kind of free speech absolutist that, publish and be damned, the government can't censor anything that you do. And then I saw what happened with Charlie Hebdo. And one of the speeches that we don't protect in the US is speech that deliberately leads to violence. When Charlie Hebdo published for the third time a picture of Muhammad on the cover of their magazine, they knew that it would result in violence. Should that still be protected speech? In the United States, that would be protected speech. In Europe, maybe not. And it made me start thinking that this absolute free speech model that the US has, which is an outlier compared to the rest of the world, is too extreme. The platforms are not governed by the First Amendment. They can censor speech on their platform. Why shouldn't they get rid of hate speech, and certainly speech that leads to violence? I think that is something that has to be thought about in a different way. One of the core ideas of information in a democracy is this idea of the marketplace of ideas. It comes from John Stuart Mill and Milton, and Justice Holmes wrote about it in a famous free speech case, which was this idea that the truth will win out in the marketplace of ideas. It's a lovely thought. I've always believed it. But now the marketplace of ideas is changing. It's a different kind of market. That was a much more idealistic view that somehow truth will win out over falsehood. With the rise of disinformation and with the instant example of it all around the world, the truth doesn't win out in the marketplace of ideas. There's a wholly different market. And so we have to think about it in a different way than we used to think about it.
Are we in the beginning of the beginning when it comes to fighting disinformation?
I think we're still at the beginning. I'm a skeptic about the role of government in the entire information war. I mean, one of the things I saw in Washington is that people, when they're against something, they put the word counter in front of it and they think they're doing something about it. So they did counter disinformation or counter terrorism. That doesn't really do anything. The problem of government doing something about it is basically government is the least qualified person to rebut a negative narrative to most of the viewers because they question government as it is. To me, one of the really big challenges is this intellectual, philosophical one, which is people always think, yes, if there's wrong information or disinformation, you need to counter it right away. Well, one of the things that social science shows is that people absorb the negative or wrong information more deeply than they absorb the correction. The correction comes too late, even if it happens instantly, and there are what psychologists call belief echoes. So when somebody retweets a Donald Trump tweet to correct it, they're making a larger impression on the person who's getting it by having that Trumpian disinformation in the original tweet.
To conclude, tell me a story about democracy. Tell me a story that's powerful.
A couple of months into my tenure at the State Department, I was home for the weekend and I got a call from the information desk of the State Department saying they had the Secretary of State on the line. But it wasn't John Kerry, my boss, it was Hillary Clinton. And I thought, how nice this is. She's calling to congratulate me. I've known her for many years. She was supportive of me going into the State Department. And the phone rang, I picked it up and I said, Madam Secretary. And instead of congratulating me, she launched into this fusillade about how there's an information war going around the world. We're getting beaten. She said, I remember the State Department is issuing press releases while everybody else is on Twitter. She said the Russians are adept at this more so than anyone realizes in the State.
What year was this?
This was 2014. Because Putin had taken a great distaste to Hillary Clinton and thought that she had created these demonstrations against Putin in the 2011 elections. And she also understood that the Russians were very adept at this digital disinformation. And she said, there's nobody at the State Department who understands the extent of what Russia is able to do. And the irony, of course, is this is 2014, 2 years before she ran for the presidency, where her whole race was upended by Russian disinformation, which they apparently didn't completely see. But she was way ahead of the curve in understanding what the Russians were up to and their abilities and the power of disinformation to alter the democratic process.